Good evening and welcome everybody. My name is Sive O'Neill and I'm the Policy Coordinator of Stop Climate Chaos, and I'm joined this evening by my colleagues Oisin Coughlin and Anya O'Gorman, also of Stop Climate Chaos and Friends of the Earth, and by Diarmuid Torney, lecturer in the School of Law and Government at DCU, an expertise in climate policy and governance. So we're very excited to present to you this evening this webinar on what is proposed to be included in the new climate law. The government, when it formed, promised that they would introduce new legislation to implement the recommendations of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action from last year. And they've promised to do it within 100 days. And that 100 days is coming up very soon, in or around the 5th of October. So the purpose of this evening's webinar is to follow on from our discussion last week about the judgment in the climate case and think about what needs to be in this law, what was wrong with the existing 2015 Act, and what we think should be reflected in it to ensure that we bed down our legally binding commitments under the Paris Agreement and set in place much more stringent governance arrangements across government departments, public bodies, so that everybody is working on the same decarbonisation trajectory. So to kick off this evening, I'm going to introduce you to Oisin Coughlin. Oisin is a veteran of climate law campaigning, having campaigned for it during the period leading up to the last Green Party and Fianna Fáil government back in 2007, 2011, and campaigned over a number of years as various pieces of legislation came and went. Sometimes bits of them got passed and got support, and sometimes they didn't. And he's going to give us a little bit of context to the webinar this evening and to what's proposed for this climate bill. So I'll let you get going, Oisin. And just to say, sorry, just before you do, that we have a Q&A function here at the bottom of your screen. So if anybody would like to put a question to the panelists, just pop it in there rather than in the chat box. And that will give other people a chance to use a thumbs up kind of function so that they can vote up any particular question that they definitely want to see answered. So with that out of the way, Oisin, I'll let you get going. Thank you.
Thanks, Sive, and it's really good to be here with you all again in this now that autumn is here and we're still in various stages of being confined to our homes. It's wonderful that so many of you can join us to talk about what is still happening and what can happen around climate action. So as Sive said, I've been going on about climate laws for a long time. Friends of the Earth campaigned for them in the UK in 2005, 2008. And due to a very particular set of circumstances when David Cameron was trying to be hugging huskies and being green, got both government and opposition. He was in opposition at the time, support. And very quickly they had a strong climate law in place by the end of 2008. And other Friends of the Earth began to campaign for that around Europe at the time. And we launched our campaign here in April 2007 for climate law before that election then. But it was a minority taste. It was only in the Labour Party manifesto then, not even the Green Party manifesto. And Stop Climate Chaos, which formed in April 2007, the coalition with Trócaire and Christian Aid and Concern and Oxfam and the National Youth Council and many others, chose the climate laws. One of the things it was asking for, among many, climate justice, climate finance, etc., among many issues, and campaigned on together for what we thought might be a 3-year campaign like the UK. Instead, it turned out to be 2 4-year campaigns, because the first one ended when the Fianna Fáil Green Party government collapsed in 2011, and we started all over again with the Fine Gael Labour one in 2011, and finally won a climate law in 2015, the one that was used recently in the Supreme Court case. Now, that climate law that we got in 2015 was nothing like as strong as we wanted it to be. It didn't have various measures, which we'll hear about tonight, various mechanisms in it that we wanted. We were disappointed, but we were also, glad that we got something, because in fact, that national mitigation plan that was struck down by the Supreme Court using the climate law recently wouldn't have even happened if that climate law hadn't come to pass, because it was very clear to us the government was so much running away from its targets in the middle of the last decade that they had just decided they would have no plan for how to meet the 2020 targets, because it was less embarrassing that way. And the law forced them to have a plan, which was then inadequate and which the court then struck down. We had already struck it down politically and morally in our campaigning, but as we talked about the last time, the climate law case was was really landmark and shows that laws are give various ways of accountability, including in the courts, although we think that primarily the law should be driving action in the first place through government and accountability to Parliament. Anyway, that's the very short history of those campaigns for a climate law. What's so exciting now is we are now on the brink, after another round of campaigning since 2017, on the brink of getting the climate law that we were looking for 13 years ago in 2007 and since. Because we don't know what's in this yet. The government will publish it in early October, we expect, on time. But we know it's based on the all-party consensus in the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action last year, which itself was sort of making real the mandate from the Citizens' Assembly. And a lot of that was through campaign. There was various processes around that, both political and public. But our campaigning both accompanied the Citizens' Assembly and specifically really strongly input into the deliberations of the Joint Oireachtas Committee, around which governance was central. The first chapter is on governance, and it's around getting the framework right for the policies that will follow. And that's actually what I want to spend a tiny bit of my time talking about now is what the law is and what it isn't, because there can be confusion about that. Because ultimately what we need is actual measures that bring down emissions and that help people to reduce their pollution and that force the systems like energy and transport to be less polluting. But the law actually isn't directly about that at all. The law is the governance framework. It's not the policies and measures. It's the analogy I use, it's the rules of the game rather than the outcome or rather than the score. So we want to change the rules of the game. We want to level the playing field so that the policy making is more transparent, more evidence-based, on advice from the Climate Action Council with strong scientific input, with a legal mandate to produce plans in a timely manner, with oversight from Parliament, with targets in law. So the two things that have driven action in the UK based on that is having a long-term target in law and having these 5-year pollution caps, these emissions limits that are called carbon budgets, but nothing to do with money, nothing to do with carbon tax, but amounts of carbon you're allowed to emit over a 5-year period. Having those approved by Parliament really gives a mandate and an imperative for all departments to make emissions. We describe it as all departments across government to take climate action seriously, and all governments over time to take action consistently. So that's what the law is about. It's not about specific measures. It's not about even the kind of the detail that we're all very interested in, but it will help us win those battles, and we'll still have to win each and individual battle, whether it's around a just transition for the workers in Moneypoint, whether it's about affordable, accessible transport, whether it's about cycling and walking, whether it's about the retrofitting program, focusing public money on poorer households and making it easy for the rest of us to borrow to be able to have a payback scheme. All of those things will still remain to be done, but we know both inside government and from a campaigning perspective, if the framework is in law, it's much more likely action will follow. That's the evidence from elsewhere, and that's why in the campaigning we're launching today around this, which is kind of the next phase of our campaigning for faster and fairer climate action, the law is only one part of the jigsaw. It's the cornerstone, it's the platform for action, let's say, but actually it's the rest of it that's really important. And the other stages that are promised in the programme for government and that follow the logical sequence that we have been talking about for years is the next thing is we need the new Climate Council. With the current one ends its term at the end of the year. If the climate law is passed by Christmas, which we're now calling for, the new one will be appointed under the new law. It will have, we hope, more scientists, fewer economists, fewer men, more ecologists, more social scientists, not just economists, and will give the government far stronger and far more holistic and integrated advice on how we should cut our emissions and what our 5-year budgets, 5-year targets should be. And then the next thing the government will have to do is to produce a new climate action plan. Because the current statutory one, the one done by law, is the National Mitigation Plan that was struck down by the Supreme Court in August. Now, the government did produce a political plan, not a statutory one, last year, which was an improvement on the 2017 one. They said they'd renew that every year. Obviously, the election and COVID got in the way this year. So they'll now probably bring those two things together next year in a new statutory one that will replace the one struck down by the court. And that's the real game. Those are the outcomes we need to see, the real measures and policies that will reduce emissions in line with Ireland's commitments. And so therefore, the other thing we're calling for from today, as well as the law being passed by Christmas to have that framework in place that to really drive action, is dialogue. Because we need to bring people with us, we need to involve people, both national stakeholders and local communities. And we've seen, while we in the IFA and IBEC differ on lots of things, and even with the trade unions where we try to work together, there's obviously tensions around how fast you close money point. But we know from being in spaces with them, they all don't think the government doesn't do enough dialogue, doesn't do social dialogue properly on the policies that will affect climate, and doesn't seek the kind of consensus and buy-in that would actually make action easier. And secondly, the last government launched what they called a national dialogue on climate action, but it was actually quite interesting regional assemblies and talk of local interaction. But that didn't take off. The regional assemblies were good, but they ran out of steam, as in the government ran out of steam and stopped doing it, basically. And I know that Teresa Donoghue, who from both FASTA and An Taisce, who's on the Stop Climate Case Steering Committee, has been thinking about this a lot over many years and pushing for proper local participation using the public participation networks in local areas, to be involved with local councils, local authorities, to actually see how you do both the coping with climate change that we now know is unavoidable, and avoiding the climate breakdown by reducing emissions, the climate breakdown that we couldn't manage. So we need that local engagement and local participation, as well as the national stakeholder dialogue. And we want the government to launch that at the same time as they launch the bill. So that while Parliament is passing the bill by Christmas, we can begin to get serious about building the societal consensus at all levels of society. That means that when the government produces a really strong climate action plan next year, through that dialogue and through all our campaigning, we hope that it will land well and actually get done. Because we know otherwise what happens is vested interests, vocal minorities get a lot of traction, get a lot of airtime, and pick off lots and lots of the policies that are proposed, and they don't happen. And in the old days, what happened was they weren't replaced. The idea of the climate law, of course, is that they have to be replaced by something. You might change the mechanisms, but you have to meet the targets. So that will give us much stronger framework for the discussion. The discussion won't be whether we make cuts or what our targets will be, because that will be decided by the science and by the council and by the parliament and by the government. It'll be how do we generate the actions to actually reduce emissions. So that's, and we've launched today as well. We've written to all TDs today, and we'll be talking a bit more about this later. Not just a reminder of those steps they need to take, but the principles that we will be using as benchmarks as we evaluate each step along the way. I mean, there might be more associated with one step than the other, but they are accountability, which the law is really seriously about. They are dialogue, as I mentioned. They are science, which in the first instance needs to be properly reflected in the Climate Action Council. It wasn't in the outgoing council, but it needs to be reflected across all our policies. Urgency, we can't leave the emissions reductions until the second half of this decade. We've been leaving them for decades and decades. The emissions caps, the pollution limits that are put in place through the law, once the law is in place, must make sure we act now in the first 5 years. And finally, but most importantly, fairness. Both the climate justice internationally, Ireland must do its fair share. We're nowhere near that, even with the current promises. We need to get on with the current promises, and then we need to really keep pushing the idea of climate justice internationally. That means both faster climate action and paying our fair share, which we haven't been doing, into those funds to help poorer countries both cope with the consequences of climate change that they can't avoid, and indeed transition their own economies. And fairness here, that idea of the just transition, not just for workers in fossil fuel plants, probably also for changing our model of farming will involve a just transition for farmers, and making sure that the policies we put in place do not unequally punish those or penalize those on lower incomes. That this is about system change in energy, transport, food, land, etc., that makes less polluting options easily available and affordable for all, and they are big political decisions. This is not about individual responsibility. It's about big systemic change driven by government and government policy and state intervention. And that's what climate change. That's what Stop Climate Chaos as a coalition will be campaigning for in our faster and fairer climate action campaign. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Oisín. Just before we go to Dermot, because you are doing a great job on the timekeeping there, I just have one question for you, Oisín, which is, as activists, what should we be looking out for in terms of any dodgy loopholes or language that might undermine some of these commitments that have already been made, but depending on how they're introduced into law, they can be, as we know from experience, written in certain ways that create loopholes and opt-outs for either certain sectors or muddy the responsibilities of the ministers, for example. Have you any examples of what we should particularly watch out for?
I will try and answer this question, and then I will make you answer it, because you know this. You know the answer to this question far more than me, Saif, and you're here too. But I know, for example, one of the key things for us is that we want the carbon budget, as it's called, which is a confusing term, but that 5-year emissions cap, the pollution ceiling, that must cover all gases and all sectors, a single national carbon budget for the whole economy and for the whole of society. We don't to be upfront about this, we don't give agriculture a whole other bucket of gases or bucket of share of the pie to itself. All sectors are together in a national budget. That bit will be decided, will be voted on by the Dáil, and it'll be the binding target for the 5 years. Underneath that, then the government decides which sectors get how much allowances, and we can decide to give agriculture more emissions and give transport less. But the idea is you want the sectors and society to think about those trade-offs and not to give any one sector a free pass, because that's what's happened over and over again. We have a notional target nationally, and then every sector makes its case for not us, not now, not yet, and nothing happens, and we miss the target. The targets have to be legally binding, and then you negotiate, like we do in our fiscal budgets. We can negotiate who gets what share of the pie, and therefore what actions people have to take. So that's, for me, the key thing, that there must be a single national pollution envelope, pollution cap, which is then, as a result of government negotiation and vested interests lobbying, like you get for the actual budget, is shared out on a democratic basis, basically, between the different sectors, and action follows from that.
That's a great reminder. Some months ago, Stop Climate Chaos ran a webinar about agriculture and the role of agriculture and land use in climate policy. And of course, there has been a move by some interests in the agricultural sector, particularly the sector involved in exporting, commodities in the form of dairy products and meat, live cattle exports and so on, to somehow exempt methane, or to create a separate emissions envelope for it, or a separate target. And depending on how that is carried through into the law, it could have very significant consequences for the overall budget that Ireland would have to meet. So what you're saying, Oisín, is that there shouldn't be any separate treatment for methane, that the budget should cover all greenhouse gases and all sectors. And then if there's a target below that for particular sectors that they have to achieve such and such a thing by such and such a date, so be it, but all in the context of one budget.
Yes, so to be clear, this isn't saying that every sector has to reduce emissions at precisely the same rate every year. That's not practical and maybe not be fair. But that was the way 10 years ago the bill was interpreted, on purpose to make the whole thing seem unfeasible. It may well be the case that agriculture will reduce emissions more slowly than transport, or more slowly than energy, for example, although certainly energy has made big progress already. But the point is, it must be an explicit, transparent policy decision and trade-off between sectors, and not a preemption, or not a special exemption for any one sector. As you say, we already have some sub-targets. So, for example, the outgoing government said that we would produce 70% of electricity from renewable sources by 2030. So that target will remain almost certainly. They have also targets that were less, clear about electric cars. So you could still have a target for methane, but any of those sectoral targets are basically indicators of what sectors are going to have to do in order to meet their share of the overall carbon budget, rather than a separate pot that they can just sit in and wallow in and not act.
Yes, absolutely. So we shouldn't be afraid, and I see some questions coming from people who are very active on the transport area. We shouldn't be afraid to push for targets for any particular sector or industry that needs to take action. They can be used as milestones and ways of keeping people accountable and giving clear direction to that economic sector. But the overall purpose of carbon budgets is not to to define what each sector does, but to set an emission ceiling for the whole economy. So with that, and we might come back to that, obviously it's a complicated area, and how these carbon budgets work, we might discuss again a little bit further on. But now it is my great pleasure to go to Dr. Diarmuid Torney, who is quite an expert in this particular area, has written some briefings for and submitted them to the department around what should be in the climate law, but has also participated as an expert in the background to the Citizens' Assembly, and has written many academic articles on climate governance, both in Ireland and in a comparative context. So over to you, Diarmuid. I think you might have some slides to show us, and we look forward to seeing your presentation.
Great, thanks, Sive. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so apparently I'm a little bit echoey. Apologies for that. I'll share my screen here. If you just give me a second. We haven't yet started back teaching in DCU, so I'm a little bit rusty on the presentation in Zoom. But
just while you're doing that, Diarmuid, I'll just remind everyone to use the Q&A box, and if you like other people's questions, use the thumbs up button just to give them an extra vote, and we'll make sure to get to them. Some very interesting questions coming up already. There we are. We can see you now.
You can see, great.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Sive, for the introduction, for the invitation to join you this evening, and hello, everyone. I can't claim to be quite the veteran of climate laws that Oisín is, but for about the last 5 years, I've had an interest in this area from around about the time that the 2015 climate law was passed here in Ireland. And I've been interested in questions around how we got to the point where the 2015 Act was passed, and why did it look the way it did, and also how does Ireland's climate law look in comparison to similar laws in other countries. So, as I've said, I have written a couple of briefing papers in the last couple of months, focused on the revision of Ireland's climate law, and they're available online. And my presentation draws on some of the content of those briefing papers. But before getting onto that, I actually just wanted to give a quick plug for something else that might be of interest to some of you on the call. We have a master's in climate change focused on policy, media and society that I was involved in establishing a couple of years ago, and that I teach on. We have just launched in the last few days a scholarship funded by NTR Foundation. It's a return to work scholarship, and specifically for people applying for our MSc in climate change. We have one of these scholarships to give out. It covers full fees for either full-time or part-time study, along with a modest stipend. It's open to applicants with at least 3 years of work experience who are resident in Ireland and meet the programme minimum entry requirements. We're particularly looking for candidates who have been on an extended career break and are looking to return to work in the area of climate change. The deadline is Monday of next week, the 28th of September, and in fact teaching begins the following week. So the time frame is very short on this, but if you're interested in finding out more, send me an email. My email address is there, or look up DCU Climate on Twitter. We've tweeted details and a link to further details. So on with the business of today. What I want to do is to talk, first of all, in general terms, what kinds of things do we expect to see in effective framework climate change laws, and then look at that in an Irish context. So I have 6 elements here that I want to run through. And this draws on some of the international research and literature in this area. So looking at a wide range of cases across Europe and beyond. So the first important element is a long-term commitment to decarbonisation in the form of a target. Typically for laws that exist, have targets for 2050. Some have set targets for slightly nearer than that. But the important part of this is that it tells us where we're trying to get to by a particular point in time. And notably, the 2015 Act didn't contain a numerical target. The second element is what I've called here policy stability through intermediate target setting. So this is basically society, so citizens, but also businesses, want to know that the government isn't tomorrow going to deviate from the climate policies it announced today. So if you're, as a citizen, for example, retrofitting your home or considering buying an electric vehicle, or if you're a business considering, for example, investing in energy efficient technologies for your business, you want to know that the policies in place today aren't going to be reneged upon tomorrow or next year. And you also want to know that when there's a change in government, there won't be a change in policy. And so that's a second important element that these framework climate laws do. They give medium-term policy stability. A third important element is that these laws typically provide some mechanism for incorporating the advice of scientific and other experts. And they provide a structured way of incorporating that advice into policymaking. A fourth important element is that it puts in place a robust and methodical policy planning framework. So building on what Oisín said earlier, it's not policy making in an ad hoc way. There is a clear structure and process to what policy plans need to be put in place at what time intervals and covering what time horizon. So it makes explicit what the policy planning system has to do. A fifth and really important element is around monitoring, enforcement, and accountability. So these laws typically provide mechanisms for figuring out, are we on track to meet our targets? And once the target periods have passed, have we met those targets? And generating accountability around whether those targets are met. And there's an interesting point around enforcement and to what extent these laws can provide a stick with which to effectively beat government if targets aren't met. My personal view is that element of these laws is overplayed, because if we've got to the point where a target hasn't been met, it's too late. We know that greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere, so we really need these monitoring and accountability processes to be working in real time, rather than waiting to figure out have we missed the target and then penalising the government in some way. So I think the monitoring and accountability elements are the really important parts here. And then my last point really isn't so much a point about the laws themselves, but it's important to see these as part of a broader jigsaw, and Oisín talked about this in his remarks as well, that these laws aren't the beginning and end of what we do on climate change. They're part of an all-of-government, but also an all-of-society approach to climate action. So those are our 6 key elements that are usually found in effective framework climate change laws. So in the rest of my comments, I'm going to go through those 6 elements. I'm going to talk a little bit about a draft of the climate law that was published by the outgoing government in January. And I want to start off by saying that actually the draft in January was already significantly stronger than the 2015 Act. So it's a strong basis on which to work, on which to build, but nonetheless there are ways in which it could be strengthened. So in terms of the long-term commitment to decarbonisation, the wording in that January draft was that the transition to a net zero, climate resilient and environmentally sustainable economy by the end of the year 2050. And that net zero element is important, and we could have a discussion around is that exactly the right target? But the important point compared to the 2015 Act is that there is a number in there, which there wasn't in the 2015 Act. So it provides a long-term destination, if you like. The second element is policy stability through intermediate target setting. And as Oisín said, the draft back in January provides a system of 5-year carbon caps. In common with Oisín, I don't like the term budgets as well, because most people understand budgets as something else involving money. They're carbon limits, carbon caps, and they're to be set 10 years in advance by government, following advice from the Climate Action Council and approved by Parliament. And there are two bits that I want to pick out there. One is the set 10 years in advance. So that's the policy stability. So we know in advance what the overall policy framework will be for 15 years, because these are 5-year carbon budgets. So you're setting a budget 10 years in advance, and that's a 5-year budget. So you have effectively certainty on these carbon limits for a period of 15 years when they're being set. And the other element I wanted to pick up on is this sequence of decision making. So the carbon budgets are proposed by government following advice by the Climate Action Council, and then they are approved by Parliament. And this, I think, provides an appropriate balance between incorporating expert advice into decision making, but still maintaining the ultimate decision making power in the hands of elected officials. The third element is around expert advice. So the role of the existing Climate Change Advisory Council is to be strengthened. It's to be renamed the Climate Action Council. In the January draft, I think there were still questions around the composition, particularly the appointment of what are called ex officio members. So those are members that are members of the council by virtue of the fact that they head up other state bodies, mostly state bodies, with the exception of the ESRI. I can go into the details of that in the discussion if that's of interest. There are also, I think, remaining questions around resourcing. So I think it's fair to say that the existing Climate Change Advisory Council, I think, has done a good job given the mandate it had, and particularly given the limited resources it was given. And if we are to expect it to play a more significant role, then I think it needs to be endowed with more resources. So, sorry. So, right. The fourth element is the policy planning framework. So this is an evolution of what's in the 2015 Act, which had a requirement for a national mitigation plan, the plan that was struck down by the Supreme Court in July, and a national adaptation framework. There's much more to the policy planning framework. Here it starts ultimately with the national transition objective, the 20 net zero by 2050 as it's currently drafted. Then there are the 5-year carbon limits, the carbon caps to be set 15 years in advance. The long-term strategy in the draft as published in January will effectively replace the national mitigation plan of the 2015 Act, which is to cover the period of 3 5-year carbon budgets, but also have a longer term perspective of 30 years. So that addresses one of the criticisms of the Supreme Court, for those of you who followed that judgment closely. And then the Climate Action Plan that Oisín referenced in his remarks, that was on a non-statutory basis published last year. That's to be put on a statutory basis, which is to say that there will be a requirement on government to update that annually. And that's really focused on the short term. That's focused on the next carbon budget period. Monitoring, enforcement and accountability. There was a curious, I think, anomaly in the January draft that it set up this quite complex, quite elaborate system of setting these carbon limits, carbon budgets. But it wasn't clear, it wasn't explicitly stated anywhere in the text of that draft that there was actually a duty on government to achieve the carbon budgets, which to me looked a little odd, in that the whole point, presumably, of setting up a system as elaborate as the system that was set up under the January draft would be, so that it placed an obligation on government. So the language around that, I think, could be strengthened. And then finally, and reiterating a point I made earlier on, it's important to see the climate law in a broader context. And that really, that it's not just a standalone piece of legislation. And that leads me on to 2 concluding remarks that I wanted to leave you with around what a framework climate law is not. So I've talked so far about what an effective, a strong climate law is, but there are 2 things that I want to clarify we shouldn't expect of a framework climate law. So the first thing is that we shouldn't expect it to be everything we could possibly want to do on climate action. It's the framework within which we develop and implement climate policy. It's not the details. So we shouldn't be looking at a framework climate law and looking to see if every possible policy instrument in every sector is there. That's not what these laws are designed to do. They're also not everything we need to do. So I get the impression sometimes that there is almost mythical thinking around these framework climate laws, that targets, because they're legally binding, are effectively self-implementing. If we have strong legally binding targets, they'll do all the heavy lifting. And that's certainly not the case. And Oisín referred to this in his remarks earlier on. They are an important framework, and they put certain constraints on policymakers, but they won't implement themselves. And so that just reiterates the point of seeing these framework climate laws as one part of a much bigger jigsaw. So just to finish off, as I said earlier, I wrote a couple of briefing papers on this topic earlier this summer, published in July. Anyone looking for a cure for insomnia, they come very highly recommended. My email address is there if anyone wants to get in touch, my Twitter handle, and the page on my personal website where those 2 briefing papers are hosted. The other thing I have on the slide there is a report by an NGO in Germany called Ecologic Institute, who published a report in February of this year called Climate Laws in Europe. And it's a really good overview of the landscape of these kinds of climate laws in a variety of European countries. So if you're interested in finding out what other countries do in terms of developing climate laws, that's a really good place to start.
Thank you so much, Dermot. And thank you also for your contributions to this particular debate, because your input, I think, has been really enriching for those of us in NGOs and civil society. And I think it's contributed enormously to the quality of the debate that we are hoping to see at the Climate Action Committee when the bill is published. So there's a few questions I'm going to come to, but there's one in particular I wanted to ask you that came up quite a few times, Diarmuid, and that's really about enforcement. So we have these carbon budgets that will be set down, and you raised the question of, well, is anybody really obliged to meet them or stick to them? And a few people have asked in the Q&A, what happens if the budget isn't met? Is there a banking and borrowing facility envisaged? And even if there is, what if that is breached? What happens? You know, what's the accountability mechanism then?
Sure. So in the course of writing these two briefing papers earlier in the summer, I went back and looked at some of the accounts of the UK Climate Change Act, which many consider to be a really strong piece of legislation. And I'd forgotten about this, but in one of the accounts, I read that Friends of the Earth started the campaign, as Oisín said, for the UK Climate Change Act. And in their initial proposal, they proposed that the Secretary of State for the Environment would have his or her salary deducted, docked, if the government didn't meet the carbon budgets. And it's not hugely surprising that that element didn't survive in the final version of the law. On the question of borrowing, there is, and actually the January draft acknowledges this as something that required further further work, that there is provision for essentially unlimited borrowing, or there are no constraints on borrowing. So between carbon budgets. So if a government is not going to meet today's carbon budget, they can borrow to an unlimited extent from the next carbon budget. But even the draft in January specified that more work needed to be done on that. The Climate Change Advisory Council, I think, flagged that as an issue. In my briefing paper, I suggested that the UK Climate Change Act be followed, which is that there is a maximum 1% of borrowing that can be allowed. But the broader kind of almost more philosophical point about what happens if a government doesn't meet a carbon budget is slightly tricky, I think, from both a legal and a moral perspective, because government holds some of the levers, but they don't actually hold all of the levers. And so even the UK Climate Change Act, which we consider to be a particularly strong example of legislation of this kind, and the legal research I've seen on it suggests that it's not really clear what would happen if the UK government failed to achieve one of its carbon budgets. The Secretary of State or the government is required to give an explanation to Parliament, but it's not ultimately clear from a legal perspective what would happen. And I think that stems from the fact that it's to some extent questionable whether you can hold someone accountable for something that's not within their control. And so there's, you know, I think in the legal scholarship there's a debate around that. But I'd come back to the point I made in my remarks, which is that the really important thing is to get the accountability right as we go along. And so I'd make a distinction between legal accountability and legal remedy in the case of a carbon budget not being met, and the kind of legal case that Climate Case Ireland took, Friends of the Irish Environment. So that was a legal challenge to whether the government was doing the planning process right. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an effective legal remedy. If we wait until the carbon budget has the budget period has passed, and then challenge the government. I mean, in effect, you can score a moral victory, but it's too late, because those greenhouse gas emissions have been emitted and will remain in the atmosphere for decades to centuries.
Great, thank you. Now, we've got some fantastic questions coming in, but just one that I might address quickly myself relates to the role of the bill in addressing upstream emissions or consumption emissions or aviation emissions. And just to quickly answer that, or all three of those, under the UNFCCC guidelines, countries report on their emissions in a very specific way, and aviation emissions are treated as they must be reported, but you're not sort of responsible for doing anything about them. And that's for two reasons, partly because of international transport and the way that fuel is bunkered anywhere in the world, essentially. And it wouldn't be possible for unilateral action to make much of a difference, so it was claimed. So it was decided to ask the international, the ICAO, kind of the Civil Aviation Authority, to address the question of aviation emissions and to produce some sort of mechanism. They were very slow to do that, but they have developed a mechanism that will kick in the next 2 years. And in the meantime, the European Union introduced the internal flights within the European Union into the emissions trading scheme. So it's not that aviation emissions are being addressed adequately or properly, but they sort of treated differently to the, say, emissions from the energy system and transport. And in relation to upstream emissions or consumption emissions, so, for example, if you or I were to take a flight, that doesn't really count in the same way, or products that are imported into Europe from outside of Europe, manufactured goods, cars, whatever. So those emissions are reported on the basis of which territory they originate from, as opposed to where the product is eventually used or consumed. And that's just the way that it works. The science around actually measuring consumption emissions has improved dramatically, and there is a lot of interesting information available. But as such, we don't have them covered under the Paris Agreement or under any of the other mechanisms in the same way. That is work that will have to be done and addressed. And interestingly, the European Green Deal does mention, although I don't know how realistic it is, the introduction of what's called a border tax adjustment, which is to account for the imported carbon emissions into the EU in some way via a tax mechanism, but that will likely run into other kind of trade difficulties. So it's just to answer those questions, those emissions, yes, will not be covered really in the law. It's possible for the bill to make provision for what the government thinks should happen to aviation emissions or consumption, and that's why references to things like sustainable development do matter. They really do matter, because they guide government policy in those areas. But the emissions will be reported in the way that we are required to under the UNFCCC for all its weaknesses. That's just the template. So if it's okay, I'll just go on to one fantastic question that got lots of votes from Ali Sheridan. And Ali was asking, can the law tell us or dictate what is fair? How can we integrate social justice into the kind of carbon budgeting process? So in other words, how do we deal with the question of fairness in the context of these legally binding commitments? I don't know which of you might like to take that. Great question and very popular.
It is a great question. I can offer a couple of responses. So one is, there's a whole list of things in the 2015 Act, and that will be in the amended Act when the amendment bill is passed, that the government must have regard for in developing policy. And so there's a reference to climate justice in there, but some of the language there could be potentially strengthened, possibly a reference to just transition in there. The carbon budgets are going to be and just to come back to the process of how those are to be set. the Climate Action Council will be tasked with making the first proposal for what those carbon budgets will be, and explaining why it made a particular proposal. And I point this out in the briefing paper. I think it was 6 of the 7 appointees by government were economists last time around. And a lot of the ex officio members are economists as well. And my own view is that economists have a really important contribution to climate policy making to make, but that a broader range, as Oisín was saying earlier on, a broader range of perspectives are needed. And so, for example, including in the appointment of the Climate Action Council, someone who explicitly has an expertise in climate justice. For example, a philosopher who works on questions of justice would be one way to address that. And then the final part of my answer would be that it's important to build justice and just transition into everything we do. So, not to see what we do and don't get into the climate law as the be-all and end-all, and the only way to achieve a just transition and climate justice.
Super. Oisín, I might ask you something else that's come in, and it's a question about the EU target by Shane. Shane is noting that the EU has now published its proposal to increase the target for 2030 across the EU to 55%. And that would mean that even though Ireland has significantly ramped up ambition, we'd still be lagging behind the EU target. So how will that affect the law? Is it possible for us to fix a lower target than what the EU would like us to do?
I'll answer that. Just one, if I can, just one other line on the issue of fairness, and that is that I don't think the law, this is what I wrote in the provisional answer, I don't think the law can dictate it. I think Diarmaid's given you a lot of aspects. The other aspect is we have to keep on campaigning, as in a democracy, these issues of distribution and allocation and fairness are decided by campaigning, lobbying, parliamentary debate and elections. It is democratic choices through the, engineered through the interaction of the political system and the populace that give us the outcomes we end up with. This will change the rules of the game in one aspect of policy on climate, but we still have to keep fighting every battle and seek with a bit more of a level playing field now, as I said. But we still have to fight for outcomes that we actually are acceptable, both in terms of reducing emissions fast enough and doing it fairly. On the issue of the EU, so this is the first time an Irish government is putting any numerical target into law. And it's the first time it's doing it before the European Union. So it's occasionally European Union targets have had quasi-legal effects in Ireland, but we are now putting into our own national law, our own target, before the EU has decided what to target for that. And that's a huge victory for campaigners because it's been resisted tooth and nail for 15 years. It doesn't mean the target's good enough or fast enough, probably not. And one other thing to say about the target that's going into the law is that it's not, we will be insisting that we would like it to be sooner than 2050, for example, but I don't know if that's winnable because it's already been agreed in the programme for government that that's what it is. And that's generally in line with the European Union 2050 target. And there are very few laws that are currently more ambitious than that in the world. But at the very least, it should say at the latest, as in it shouldn't be a ceiling on our ambition. It should be a floor on our ambition. To use the dreaded phrase, it's a backstop. It's a legal backstop. The battle to do it faster and fairer and sooner and bigger and better, starts again the next day, but we now have bigger weapons, bigger levers in our hand. On the EU thing, the other thing to say is that apart from anything else, it gets complicated because there's different baselines. That this government's target of 51% reduction by 2030 is compared to 2018, which was the figures available when the parties were negotiating the programme for government. The EU target is related to 1990. And so there's a fair bit of maths to do there. And of course, it gets broken down into both the European ETS, European level emissions, and also then the bit that nation states are responsible for, whereas the Irish government correctly has chosen a whole of economy target for itself, which cuts across both of those European categories. So there's lots more maths to do. The main thing to say about the European target is that while 55% is an improvement on the 40% that's there currently, that the science and equity would suggest that the European share, and this is what the NGOs, including Friends of the Earth Europe and Climate Action Network Europe and all our colleagues in Stop Climate Chaos at the European level, are saying the EU target should be, if I remember correctly, 65%, at least 60. Maybe I can't remember if it's 60 or 65, but more than the current proposal from the Commission. The Parliament has voted for 60. I think the NGOs are at 65, more in line with science. So, it's unlikely that the European target will be as good as it should be, and it's expressing a slightly different thing to the Irish target, and it won't necessarily mean. But apart from anything else, the 2030 target will not be specified in the law, as far as we can tell. The deal is to put the 2050 target into law. The 2030 target, the 2025 target, 2035 target will be will be adopted by the Dáil as those 5-year pollution caps, emission ceilings, technically known as carbon budgets.
Wow, it's a lot to take in, all these different plans and obligations. Some of them will be written into the law and some of them will appear over time as the various plans and budgets are published. So there's amazing questions here, but it makes sense to me, I think, to go to the perspective of someone trying to do something in their local community. So I think it's Maeve, and I think at least one or two other people raised the question of how will this look at a local level? What does climate dialogue mean? If you're an activist in a local community wanting to see things happen, what difference will this law make, and what can Stop Climate Chaos offer? I might go to Anya actually to answer that, because Anya has been working hard with lots of local groups around the country. But if there's other points you want to make, Diarmuid and Oisín, come back in as well.
This is a useful way to start talking about what you can actually start doing and what we can be doing together. I just saw someone tweeted that it's a great antidote to climate anxiety to hear such amazing people talking about the things we can do to change, and it's an equally great antidote to climate anxiety to get together with people in your local area and take action to help make this change. And we can't achieve the things that we're all talking about here if we don't all come together to take action. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen. And okay, I'm going to show you this. So what we've done is we've been working with, and many of you may already be part of groups across the country who've worked with us before on the One Future campaign. We've been doing TD calls during the summer. We've had loads of webinars. So it's great. I've seen a lot of names of people who are already working with us and who are working on issues in your own local constituencies. And it's nice that we can work together from a national and a local perspective. And for those people asking, what can I do locally? What we'll be doing is getting in contact with people. I'm going to put a form to sign up in the chat box. But if you want to sign up to meet other people who are doing things in your local area, we can link you up with those. And we'll also be helping people build groups in their local area to achieve the goals that we've spoken about. So those goals, just to remind you of this new campaign that we're launching, are accountability, so a new climate law by Christmas, dialogue, proper local and national climate dialogue with interest groups and the public, science, so a new stronger climate council by January, and urgency, that those 5-year pollution limits that drive immediate action across all government and departments happen now and drive immediate action. And then we've got some values, which are that these are fair. They reduce inequality, they protect and restore nature, and they reflect our share of the global carbon budget. And that means that what we want to do is we want to be linking things that happen on the ground in your local areas. If you're working with your county councils, if you're working with your local PPNs, looking at local climate dialogue, as well as looking at national climate dialogue. So what we're going to be doing is asking you to sign up, and we'll be in touch with more kind of concrete proposals. We'll be working with you to see what does it look like for you in your county, in your constituency, on the ground. And then we can share learnings across the country, as well as coming together to target these big issues, such as, you know, we need a new climate law by Christmas. So I will put a form into the chat box, and before the end of the evening if you want to sign up, but you'll also get an email with that during the week. And the other thing is, you know, it's good to take action together, to start off taking action together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite everyone. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to put a link in the chat box, and we're going to send an email to all our TDs together now to ask for this new climate law by Christmas and climate dialogue. So here is the link, and if we can all do it together, that will mean that there's going to be 200 emails sent now to TDs launching this campaign and asking TDs to make sure that this climate law is passed by Christmas and that they start to instigate proper climate dialogue. And then once you sign up to these groups, and once we start working with the groups and you start working with us, then we'll be able to see what does that look like in your local community, what actions can be taking to talk to your TD to make sure that this passes. So if you click that link now, it should bring you to the Stop Climate Chaos website, and it should take you about 2 minutes to sign up and to send that email. So in the meantime, I don't know if Oisín or Diarmuid have anything about climate dialogue or local climate dialogue to talk about now, while people are...
Can I put another question to the panel while everybody else is emailing, just to try to get through some of these terrific questions here? Hugo was asking how the law can be used to hold the fossil fuel industries to account. So what is the law going to do about getting fossil fuels out of the energy system? Because we all know that that's the main, well, you know, in Ireland we have agriculture as well, but that the main contributor to global warming is emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels. So if we don't name that, if we don't address that, what guarantee do we have that we will decarbonize our energy system in a truly ecologically sustainable way?
I can come in on that. Maybe I'm busy writing emails and not listening. The UK experience is really interesting in that regard. So the UK Climate Change Act was passed in 2008, and 10 years later, in 2018, the LSE, London School of Economics, Grantham Institute for Climate Change and Environment were commissioned to undertake a 10-year review, a kind of a look back at the successes and failures of the UK Climate Change Act. And one of the really interesting, for me anyway, for nerds like me, one of the interesting findings of that report was that the UK Climate Change Act has been most successful at driving decarbonisation of the energy system. So basically, coal is nearly gone from the UK electricity system. And it's been less successful at driving transformation in, or less immediately successful at driving transformation in transport and agriculture. I think the explanation for that is that what you have in power generation is a small number of actors, so a small number of businesses delivering the power generation, whereas what you have in agriculture and what you have in transport is millions and millions of individuals making decisions that are, of course, constrained or shaped by the system, but it's not, from a policy perspective, as easy to drive change. But to come back to the question, the UK Climate Change Act, as far as I know, though I might be wrong, doesn't say anything about fossil fuels, but it's driven fossil fuels, sorry, not fossil fuels, it's driven coal out of the power generation sector. And so I think that's something to bear in mind for Friends of the Earth and other organizations in this space going forward as well, that this kind of law is particularly good at driving decarbonisation in certain sectors of the economy, and it needs a lot more groundwork and support and push from from civil society to drive decarbonisation in other sectors.
Thank you very much, Dermot. And another question that has come up in a few different ways from a few different people is really about the role of corporate accountability, sustainability reporting and emissions reporting. And I understand that there's quite a lot happening at European level. There's either a draft directive or something has been adopted recently and, you know, giving some kind of taxonomy or definition to what counts as emissions under different headings. But is there any scope for introducing more guidance or more requirements on corporations on how they report on their emissions in the context of this bill? It seems to be targeting very much public actors, I suppose, rather than private actors. And is that not a weakness?
Well, I guess my response to that would be to, you know, my fallback position is that these are quite limited pieces of legislation designed to do quite particular things. And if we were to expect a single piece of legislation to, you know, provide accountability frameworks across lots of different sectors and in lots of different contexts, then then the legislation would be getting really, really complex, and the opportunities for, or the temptation for vested interests to try and you know, block up the legislative process would be even greater. So you know, I think part of the beauty of this kind of legislation is that it's relatively pared back. It's relatively simple, and it provides, you know, it sets really clear expectations about what government needs to do and when, and how we check whether government is doing what it is supposed to do under the legislation. And I think that corporate accountability piece is really important, but it probably belongs in a different piece of legislation.
Okay, so we're not going to see any particular measures introduced in the bill that will address sectors like the transport sector. Quite a few people have been engaging both in the chat and the Q&A about the particular difficulties in reducing emissions from road transport. So we're not going to see, it's not going to be obvious that the carbon budgets are going to translate into things like changes to vehicle emission standards or different levels of road tax for different types of vehicles. They won't, that the carbon budgets in themselves won't deliver the EV target, for example, or any new charge. You know, so there's a gap between the governance and the action, the policy action. And how can we ensure that that gap is filled? I mean, where does that happen?
I'm conscious of time too. I'm guessing we're going to finish in the next 5 minutes, just to give people a fair warning that we're not going to keep them here all night. I mean, I think, just to extend my mangled sporting metaphor from earlier, like the passing of the climate law is a starting gun, not a finishing line. As in, it's from there we have to engage in the processes that deliver the measures we want. And you know, tonight we've talked about two of those specific things that we can do as citizens. One is contact our local TDs and engage with them, and the other is get together with others who are interested in a local area, and to do both local and national active citizenship, to put our campaigning or whatever you want to call it, activism. So that's my first answer. The second answer is like there's three stages. One is, and the second stage will help. One is just the framework that is the law. The second is the deciding of our national carbon budget and the sectoral allocations. And that debate will put more or less pressure on a particular sector to act, much more so than, you know, like once the law is forcing that deliberation to happen and those decisions to be made, that will be made. They won't just be a mathematical exercise. That will be a political exercise about what is, and an economic one, what is most feasible to do and how much will it cost. And it'll also be a political, like a power game as to who has most power in Irish society to resist having to act. And that's again where we come in as citizens to demand that all actors do their fair share. But the law itself doesn't dictate that. It's what happens under the framework of the law, under the cap. So the biggest thing, I said, two remarks to finish. One is, I said before, you know, the debate. I've been in some of these social dialogues over the years, and without that ceiling in law, all that special pleading means no one does anything, because there wasn't a center of power strong enough to resist them, either because the Taoiseach wasn't leading or because the Department of Environment was too weak. We can only hope and campaign to have a stronger Taoiseach and a stronger Department of the Environment. But having any cap in law, even if it's not yet in line with the science, as long as it's more than was currently planned by vested interests, which is any number is better than that, because they're not planning to do anything unless they're pushed. And we need to get as big a number, as good a number as possible. Once that's in place, you fundamentally change the dynamic, because then it's a negotiation between them, not against inaction, but against just among themselves. Action is a given. It's a question of who has to do the most. And that really changes it. And then on top of that, we need to keep campaigning, keep pushing for the public interest, the long-term interest. And the other big difference the law means is that, like, I've been a witness to inaction over 15 years. And for so long, that inaction could take place with nobody noticing, because there wasn't a strong parliamentary committee, there wasn't a need for the minister to come in to explain, there wasn't media coverage necessarily, there wasn't a strong climate movement 15 years ago, so they could adopt all sorts of targets. They should say the EU should have bigger targets, and they were all for EU ambition when they didn't think Ireland needed to do anything as a result. And then they would miss targets and no one would notice. Having the climate movement is strong, fundamentally having the climate movement as strong as it is now means that that's not possible anymore. And putting the law in place institutionalizes the transparency, the oversight, the scrutiny, the accountability, that at the very, very least means they have to fail in public and be held accountable for failing, like they were in the Supreme Court. And we would hope, like the rat in some test, that they'll stop failing and start acting when they keep getting hammered and being politically punished for failing to deliver emissions reductions. That's again to say that the law is just the framework, it's just the rules of the game. We have to keep playing the game harder than ever before, and we are better placed to do that than we ever have been before.
Thank you so much. I absolutely share those sentiments, and it's just so important to think about accountability in that broad sense, that just coming along to this webinar this evening, getting involved with the One Future group with Anya and the other people in your community, it's transformative potentially. We have talked, for instance, about things like adopt a TD. We have lots of ideas anyway for really connecting with the political system and with other decision makers in our communities more directly as activists, so that they are aware that we're watching them and that we're keeping an eye on what they're doing, and that they have to be held to account in the broadest political sense. And that's what we're all about doing. So I'm going to wrap up there, but I just want to give Anya an opportunity if you want to come in and just add anything about the One Future groups or e-action.
So I've just got information that 101 people have sent emails, so thank you so much. If anyone hasn't got a chance yet, you can do so after the webinar. You can do it now. I'll just put the link, or if the link is in there in the chat. Do please, if you're interested to get together with other people, to sign up to join a group. And the last thing, as someone has very kindly put in the chat, on Friday it is another, the school strikers are out. So please do follow Fridays for Future Ireland and see how you can support them. But there is, over 500 emails already sent to TDs. So, so well done everyone already.
And just to say that this webinar is being recorded. We will have it up on our website. That could be the Friends of the Earth website and Stop Climate Chaos. And in addition to that, you'll see, if you go hunting for it, the webinar recording from last week as well, with Andrew Jackson talking about the climate case judgment. So these two webinars were kind of twin webinars, originally going to be one, and then we decided to do two separate ones, so they're kind of connected. And no doubt we will be running a further series in the autumn, but thank you to everybody who's participated, who's come along, who's sent in questions and chat, but especially thank you to Diarmuid Torney for coming along this evening and contributing his expertise, and to Oisín for his patience and tolerance and endurance to campaign for this length of time for a climate law. We'll get you to the finishing line, hopefully, and we all look forward to the publication of the bill, and we will make sure that it is published, and that that it's as good as we can make it be. So thank you everybody for coming along, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar very soon.